Imagine moving so fast that reality itself begins to fray at the edges, a speed where even time seems to pause and watch. This was his world, but now something is different. His lightning, once a familiar gold, now flickers with an ominous purple, a change that brings whispers seeping into his mind from the endless dark spaces between the stars. The very power that was once his salvation has become a beacon, drawing the attention of hungry ancient gods who have tasted his impossible motion and now crave so much more. In a terrifying new reality where simply running creates dangerous ripples in the fabric of the universe, the question becomes terrifyingly simple. Can the fastest man alive possibly outrun corruption itself? The cold metal deck of the Mechanicus research vessel Omnissiah's cipher vibrated with warnings as ancient coitators registered an impossible energy spike. Margos de Langrus clutched his mechadendrite to the console, his augmented eyes widening behind layers of mechanical enhancements. The warp storm surrounding the ship had been raging for 7 standard Terran days. But this reading defied all known laws of imperial physics. Something was tearing through reality itself. Something moving faster than thought, faster than light, faster even than the corrupting whispers of the Empyrean. The ancient Magos had spent 3 centuries studying the boundary between real space and the immaterium. He knew what happened when that veil was punctured by brute force rather than carefully calculated ritual. Such violations birthed only madness and death. "Initiate emergency containment protocols," he commanded, his voice a synthetic rasp merging with the ship's machine spirit. "Whatever breaches it must not escape." The void ship's hull groaned as reality fractured. Servitors moved with mechanical precision, activating ancient technologies designed to contain demonic incursions. Null fields hummed to life, filling the laboratory chamber with a bone-deep vibration that silenced the whispers of the warp. But the energy signature continued to build, a storm of golden lightning that the ship's sensors could barely comprehend. Then it happened. A screaming tear in the fabric of reality split the chamber's air. Golden lightning erupted outward, striking consoles and servitors alike, overloading systems that had functioned flawlessly for millennia. At the center of the maelstrom, a figure materialized, wreathed in crackling energy that seemed to bend light itself around his form. He wore a crimson suit adorned with a lightning bolt emblem, his face partially obscured by a cowl, his eyes wild with confusion and panic. Barry Allen, the Flash fastest man alive, had arrived in the nightmare of the 41st millennium. The lightning surrounding him lashed out in erratic patterns, striking a containment field generator. Alarms screamed as systems failed and the ship's artificial gravity fluctuated. Barry stumbled forward, disoriented, his molecules still vibrating from the dimensional breach. His mind raced faster than any unaugmented human could comprehend, taking in the bizarre technology, the skull-adorned machinery, the red-robed figures whose bodies were more metal than flesh. "Where?" he gasped, struggling to orient himself in this alien environment. "What happened to the Speed Force?" Margos Gruss raised a mechanical arm, his voice booming through Vox speakers as binary K flooded the ship's systems. "Anomaly detected. Unknown warp entity manifestation. Initiating purge protocols." Barry's enhanced perception allowed him to see the defense turrets emerging from the chamber walls before they had fully deployed. His body responded instinctively, tapping into the speed force that had brought him here. In a blur of motion, he dodged the first salvo of energy beams, moving so quickly that he seemed to exist in multiple places simultaneously. "Wait, I'm not your enemy," he shouted, voice distorting as he accelerated. "I just need to understand where I am." The Maros made no response other than to activate more defenses. Servo skulls descended from hidden compartments, scanning the intruder with beams of crimson light. Barry felt something cold and alien brush against his consciousness as the scans attempted to categorize him. The sensation was wrong, invasive, like nothing he had experienced even against the most powerful telepaths of his world. "The anomaly resists standard classification," a monotone voice announced from hidden voxcasters. "Potential warp contamination at 97% probability." Barry didn't understand the terminology, but he recognized the threat. These people, if they could still be called that, considered him dangerous. He needed to escape to find someone who would listen. His instincts screamed at him to run. He accessed the speed force, feeling its familiar energy surge through him. But something was wrong. The speed force felt different here, turbulent, corrupted by something vast and malevolent. As he accelerated, golden lightning trailing from his body, he saw strange shapes in the electricity, faces that leered and screamed, entities that should not exist, attempting to latch on to his motion. Barry pushed through the sensation, racing toward what appeared to be a doorway. Metal bulkheads began to slam shut, but he was faster, slipping through narrowing gaps, navigating the labyrinthine corridors of the Mechanicus vessel by pure instinct. Behind him, klaxons wailed and mechanical voices chanted in a language he didn't recognize. He rounded a corner and found himself face to face with a squad of soldiers in crimson robes, carrying bizarre rifles that hummed with barely contained energy. Their eyes widened at his sudden appearance, but their training overcame their surprise. As one, they raised their weapons and fired. Barry twisted into the speed force, feeling time slow around him. The energy beams moved through the air like glowing molasses, easy to dodge. But as he moved, he felt the corruption in the speed force growing stronger. The lightning surrounding his body took on a purplish tinge, and he heard whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. So fast, the voices murmured. So perfect, a vessel for the glory of motion. The changer of ways sees you, speedster. The Lord of Labyrinth has plans for your gift. Fear spiked through Barry as he realized the speed force was being tainted by something ancient and malevolent. He pushed harder, accelerating beyond his usual limits, desperate to escape not just his pursuers, but the corruption attempting to claim his power. The ship shuddered around him as his speed increased. Reality itself seemed to warp in his wake, leaving trails of distortion that lingered like heat miragages. Barry felt the structure of the vessel giving way to his passage, molecules becoming excited by his proximity. He needed to escape before he tore the entire ship apart. Ahead, he saw what appeared to be a hangar bay visible through reinforced viewports. Small craft sat in neat rows, presumably for transport to the surface of whatever world lay below. Barry altered his course, heading for the airlocks. If he could reach one of those vessels, perhaps he could find safety. Answers, a way back home. The hangar doors began to close as automated systems responded to the security breach. Barry poured on more speed, feeling the corruption in the speed force growing stronger with each step. The purple tinge in his lightning was spreading, and the whispers grew more insistent, more seductive. Become our herald, they promised. The galaxy will kneel before the god of motion. With a final burst of desperate speed, Barry slipped through the narrowing gap of the hangar doors, feeling them brush against his back as they slammed shut. The vast chamber beyond was filled with vessels of various sizes, all bearing the same strange skull and gear iconography that seemed to dominate this world's aesthetic. Barry skidded to a halt, taking stock of his surroundings. The hangar was largely automated, with only a few of the half-machine humans present, all of whom turned to stare at the intruder wreathed in corrupted lightning. Barry felt the taint of the speed force recede slightly as he slowed, the whispering voices becoming more distant. Whatever was corrupting his power seemed to grow stronger the faster he moved. I need to borrow a ship, Barry announced, knowing they wouldn't agree but feeling compelled to try diplomacy before action. I mean, no harm. I just need to understand where I am and find a way home. The response came in the form of more weapons fire. Barry dodged easily but noticed something alarming. The energy beams were tracking him, adjusting their trajectories mid-flight as if guided by some malevolent intelligence. These weapons were designed to combat superhuman speeds. Time for a new approach. Barry raced to the nearest vessel, a sleek shuttle with angular wings and a prominent view screen. He vibrated his molecules at the ship's access panel, attempting to phase through it as he would a solid wall back home. The result was catastrophic. As his vibrating form made contact with the technology, there was a screaming discharge of energy. Barry was thrown backward, his suit smoking as the shuttle's systems erupted in cascading failures. Warning runes flashed across its hull as some kind of artificial intelligence seemed to shriek in digital agony. Tech heresy detected, announced a metallic voice. The anomaly corrupts the machine spirits. Purge authorized at all levels. Barry rolled to his feet, watching in horror as every automated system in the hangar oriented toward him. Servtor-controlled loading machines, defense turrets, even the small maintenance robots, all turned their attention to the speedster. The ship itself seemed alive and hostile. The machine spirits reject you, Herald of Chaos, intoned one of the red-robed figures, raising a staff that crackled with blue energy. Your corruption shall not spread to the Omnissiah's children. Barry had no idea what the man was talking about, but the threat was clear. He needed to escape this ship to find a place to think and plan. His gaze fell on a massive viewport showing the world below. A sprawling hive city dominating a blasted landscape. If he couldn't use their ships, perhaps he could find another way down the viewport. That was it. Barry accelerated again, feeling the corrupt speed force wrap around him like a cloak of tainted lightning. The whispers returned immediately. "Yes, run! Run to us! Your speed is a beacon in the warp. We have waited millennia for one such as you." Ignoring the voices, Barry circled the hangar at increasing velocity, building momentum. The air behind him began to ionize, forming a vacuum in his wake. Weapons fire tracked him, but always a fraction of a second too slow. With each lap, he drew closer to the reinforced viewport, calculating the precise angle and force needed. Then, with a final burst of speed, he changed direction, racing straight for the thick armored glass. Instead of attempting to break through it directly, he vibrated his molecules to their resonant frequency, creating a focused point of kinetic energy. The viewport held for a heartbeat, then shattered outward in an explosive decompression. Barry was sucked into the void beyond, the corrupt speed force lightning surrounding him, creating a temporary envelope of energy that protected him from the vacuum of space. He tumbled away from the Mechanicus vessel, a comet of golden-purple light falling toward the hive world below. As gravity claimed him and atmosphere began to build around his form, Barry oriented himself into a controlled fall. The corrupt whispers faded with distance from the ship, though they didn't disappear entirely. Whatever had tainted the speed force in this reality, it was everywhere, an underlying corruption in the very fabric of this universe. Fire built around him as he entered the upper atmosphere, his body protected by the speed force aura. Below, the details of the hive city resolved themselves. A nightmare sprawl of industrial complexes, towering spires, and cramped habitation blocks housing billions of souls. Smog choked the sky, broken by the occasional flash of industrial flame or defense laser. Barry angled his descent toward what appeared to be a less developed area, away from the densest concentrations of technology. His encounter on the ship had taught him that the machines in this world were somehow semi-sentient and hostile to his presence. He needed to find humans, real humans, who might listen. The ground rushed up to meet him. Barry vibrated his molecules to slow his descent, creating a cushion of displaced air. He impacted in what appeared to be a refuge heap at the city's edge, sending up a plume of ash and debris. The speed force absorbed most of the impact, but he still felt the breath knocked from his lungs as he carved a shallow crater in the compacted waste. For a moment he lay still, catching his breath and taking stock of his situation. The air was acrid, filled with toxic chemicals and industrial runoff. The ground beneath him squelched with unknown fluids. In the distance, massive factories belched smoke into the perpetually dark sky, their silhouettes resembling cathedrals more than industrial complexes. Barry rose unsteadily to his feet. His suit, designed to withstand the rigors of superspeed, was scorched and torn in places from the orbital fall. The lightning bolt emblem on his chest flickered with residual energy, occasionally sparking with the same purplish corruption he'd felt in the speed force. "Where am I?" he murmured, though there was no one to answer. What happened to the speed force here? A sound caught his attention, the whine of engines approaching rapidly. Barry tensed, ready to run, but his legs felt lean, the speed force sluggish and resistant. The corruption had taken more out of him than he realized. He would need to recover before attempting to use his powers at full capacity again. From the perpetual twilight of the hive city's edge emerged a patrol of armored vehicles. They were brutal utilitarian things adorned with the same skulls and eagles that seemed ubiquitous in this world. Armored figures disembarked, carrying weapons that made the guns from Barry's world look like children's toys. They moved with practiced precision, establishing a perimeter around the impact site. Unknown entity detected called a voice amplified by voxcasters. "By order of the Planetary Defense Force, you will surrender for examination. Resistance will be met with immediate termination." Barry raised his hand slowly, recognizing the futility of fighting in his weakened state. "I'm not a threat," he called back. "My name is Barry Allen. I'm lost, displaced from my world. I just want to understand where I am and find a way home." The soldiers exchanged glances, their expressions hidden behind respirator masks and visors. One of them, bearing more elaborate insignia than the others, stepped forward cautiously. "The anomaly speaks Gothic," the officer noted. Surprise evident in his voice, possible warp taint but coherent. "Alert the Inquisition. This requires specialized interrogation." Barry didn't like the sound of that. "Look, I'm not from your world. I'm a human from a planet called Earth. From a different time, maybe a different universe entirely. I accessed something called the Speed Force and it brought me here." Silence. "Anomaly," the officer commanded. "Your fate will be determined by those with authority to judge such claims. The Emperor protects against the lies of the warp. As the soldiers closed in, weapons trained on him, Barry felt a strange sensation. The corrupt whispers in the speed force grew suddenly louder, more insistent. The ground beneath his feet trembled and the soldiers faltered, looking around in confusion. Movement beneath the refuge heap, one called out. Possible ambush. Before anyone could react, the ground erupted. Twisted, malformed creatures burst from the compacted waste, their bodies a nightmarish amalgamation of human and insect forms. They moved with unnatural speed, their chitinous limbs ending in razor-sharp talons that tore through flak armor with ease. Genestealer Cult, the officer shouted, opening fire with his weapon. Purge the Xenos filth. The soldiers reacted with disciplined fury, forming a firing line and unleashing a storm of energy beams into the surging mass of creatures. Many fell, their bodies reduced to charred husks, but more kept coming, an endless tide erupting from hidden tunnels beneath the waste. Barry found himself caught in the middle of an alien ambush. The creatures largely ignored him, focusing their attack on the human soldiers, but several turned their eyeless faces toward him, sensing something different, something powerful, a decision point. Barry could flee, using what remained of his strength to escape this nightmare, or he could help these humans, hostile as they might be, against what were clearly monsters intent on slaughter. It wasn't really a choice. Barry Allen was a hero. No matter what universe he found himself in, he accessed the speed force, feeling the corrupt whispers surge as he accelerated. The purple taint in his lightning grew stronger, but he pushed through it, refusing to let the corruption take hold. Time slowed around him as he entered superspeed, the battle becoming a frozen tableau of energy beams and leaping monstrosities. Barry moved through the battlefield like a surgeon, precisely redirecting the trajectory of alien attackers, moving soldiers out of the path of lethal strikes, and delivering precisely calculated impacts to vulnerable points on the creature's anatomies. Every use of speed sent pulses of corrupt energy through his system, the whispers growing louder, promising power beyond imagining if he would only surrender to their influence. "The veil thins where you run, Herald," they murmured. "Your motion tears at reality. So perfect, so pure." Barry gritted his teeth against the seduction. "Get out of my head," he growled, channeling his frustration into a supersonic punch that shattered a Genestealer's carapace. "I'm not your herald. I'm not your anything." The soldiers watched in awe and horror as the crimson-clad figure became a blur of motion, leaving trails of corrupted lightning in his wake. Genestealers that had been leaping toward them suddenly found themselves flying in the opposite direction. Wounded comrades were suddenly pulled from danger, appearing dozens of meters from where they had fallen. The officer raised his weapon, uncertain whether to target the Xenos or the reality-bending stranger. His training demanded the elimination of all threats, but pragmatism suggested allowing the anomaly to exhaust the Genestealer force before dealing with it. "Maintain discipline," he ordered his troops. "Target the Xenos. The anomaly appears to be temporarily aligned with our interests." Barry felt his connection to the speed force weakening as the corruption grew. Each acceleration brought more whispers, more promises, more glimpses of entities waiting beyond the veil of reality. He needed to end this quickly. Gathering his remaining strength, Barry created a vortex running in a tight circle at supersonic speeds. The resulting vacuum pulled Genestealers from their feet, sending them hurtling into one another in a tangled mass. With the creatures concentrated, the soldiers poured fire into the vortex, their energy weapons incinerating the Xenos' threat in a matter of seconds. Barry staggered to a halt, his legs nearly giving way beneath him. The corrupted lightning surrounding his body flickered erratically, occasionally forming shapes that resembled leering faces or grasping hands. He felt violated, as if something had been watching him through his own power, analyzing his every move. The soldiers approached cautiously, weapons still raised but no longer aimed directly at him. The officer stepped forward, his face a mask of suspicion and reluctant gratitude. "Your intervention is noted. Anomaly," he stated formally. "However, your nature remains a threat to Imperial security. You will submit to containment and interrogation by proper authorities." Barry weighed his options. He was weakened, surrounded, and in an utterly alien world. Fighting would only reinforce their perception of him as a threat. Perhaps cooperation, at least temporarily, would yield the information he needed. "I'll come with you," he agreed, "on the condition that someone explains what's happening to me. Something's corrupting my power and I need to understand what it is before it takes control." The officer hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "The Inquisition will determine what information you require. For now you will be secured in a null field containment unit for transport to the Administratum complex. Barry allowed himself to be guided toward one of the armored vehicles. As he walked, he noticed that his footsteps left faint impressions in the ground. Not physical depressions, but distortions in reality itself, tiny tears that sealed themselves within seconds. Whatever had happened when he crossed into this universe, it had fundamentally changed his relationship with the Speed Force. The soldiers placed a strange collar around his neck, a device that hummed with energy and made the corrupted whispers recede slightly. Barry felt his connection to the Speed Force dampened, not severed but muffled as if heard through thick walls. It was both a relief and a new source of anxiety. Without his speed, he was vulnerable in this hostile world. The journey through the Hive City was a descent into industrial hell. Endless factories stretched in all directions, worked by masses of humanity living in conditions Barry could scarcely comprehend. The air grew thicker with pollution as they progressed inward until visibility was reduced to mere meters. The vehicle's powerful headlamps cutting sways through the chemical fog. Occasionally, they passed massive structures that resembled cathedrals, their spires reaching toward the hidden sky, adorned with statues of a golden figure that the soldiers referred to reverently as the Emperor. Barry gathered that this was some kind of theocratic society, though whether the Emperor was a living ruler or a religious icon remained unclear. After what seemed like hours of travel through increasingly ornate and heavily guarded districts, they arrived at a formidable complex that combined the aesthetics of a medieval fortress with advanced technology. Guns tracked their vehicle's approach, and Barry could sense energy fields scanning his presence even through the null field collar. The vehicle passed through multiple checkpoints before stopping in an underground hangar. As Barry was escorted out, he saw dozens of similar vehicles and aircraft bearing the same insignia and stylized eye combined with a skull that seemed to stare directly into his soul. "The Ordo Malleus has dispatched an Inquisitor to assess the anomaly," announced a monotone voiceover. Hidden speakers proceed to interrogation chamber Epsilon. Full null field containment protocols in effect. Barry was led through a series of security checkpoints, each more stringent than the last. The deeper they went, the more the architecture changed, transitioning from brutal Gothic designs to something more clinical and sterile. The walls were inscribed with strange symbols that hurt his eyes to look at directly, and he noticed that even his escorts seemed uncomfortable in these surroundings. Finally, they reached a chamber dominated by a circular platform surrounded by devices that hummed with the same energy as the collar around his neck. The soldiers directed Barry to stand on the platform, then retreated to positions around the perimeter of the room. Armored shutters sealed the entrances, locking them all inside. "The Inquisitor will arrive momentarily," the officer informed him, taking position near what appeared to be the main control console. "Speak only when addressed directly. Attempt no sudden movements. The defense systems in this chamber can reduce you to your component atoms in microseconds." Barry nodded, understanding the threat. He remained still on the platform, feeling the null field intensify around him, pushing the corrupted whispers even further away. For the first time since his arrival, his mind felt truly clear. Whatever technology they were using, it created a bubble of normality in this twisted universe. The main door slid open with a pneumatic hiss, admitting a figure that immediately commanded attention despite its relatively small stature. A woman entered, clad in form-fitting black armor accented with silver trim, and the same eye symbol Barry had seen throughout the complex. Her face was stern, framed by short silver hair, her eyes augmented with subtle mechanical implants that gleamed in the chamber's harsh lighting. "I am Inquisitor Katerina Grayfax of the Ordo Malleus," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "You stand accused of warp manifestation, reality distortion, and potential demonic possession. These are capital crimes under Imperial law. Your cooperation may influence whether your end is swift or agonizing." She approached the platform, studying Barry with clinical detachment. "Interesting. Your aura displays warp contamination, yet you maintain human form and coherence. Are you a demon wearing human skin or a human touched by the warp? Speak truth, for I will know if you lie." Barry met her gaze steadily. "My name is Barry Allen. I'm human from a planet called Earth, but not the Earth of this universe. I accessed an energy called the Speed Force to save my city from disaster. Something went wrong and I was pulled here. Since arriving, something has been corrupting my connection to the Speed Force, whispering to me, trying to use my power for its own purposes." The Inquisitor's eyes narrowed. "The creature speaks of traveling between realities. This aligns with the Mechanicus report from the Omnissiah's cipher. She circled the platform slowly, never taking her eyes off Barry. What you call the Speed Force bears similarities to the Immaterium, the warp that underlies all reality. If you truly crossed between universes, you would have traversed the deep warp, the realm of the Chaos Gods. She gestured to one of her attendants who activated a holithic projector. Above them appeared an image that made Barry's blood run cold. It showed his arrival on the Mechanicus ship, but from an angle he hadn't seen, revealing something horrifying. As he had materialized, surrounded by golden lightning, shadowy figures had briefly appeared in the energy, reaching toward him with clawed hands before dissipating. Your passage created a temporary warp rift, Grayfax stated. These entities attempted to follow you into real space. Your lightning, as you call it, bears the unmistakable taint of Tzeentch, the chaos god of change and sorcery. The G-Deceiver has marked you whether you realize it or not. Barry stared at the holithic image in horror. Those things, they've been whispering to me whenever I use my speed, calling me a herald, trying to get me to surrender to them. Grayfax nodded grimly. Tzeentch seeks vessels of power, particularly those who embody change and transformation. Your ability to alter reality through motion would be immensely valuable to the changer of ways. The corruption you feel is the touch of chaos attempting to turn you into a daemon prince. She turned to the control console, adjusting settings that intensified the null field. The Emperor's mercy extends even to those unwittingly touched by chaos. If what you claim is true, if you resist this corruption and seek to return to your reality, the Ordo Malleus may be able to assist you. But first we must confirm your humanity remains intact. What followed was a battery of tests that pushed Barry to his physical and mental limits. Blood samples were taken and analyzed by tech priests who muttered prayers to machine spirits as they worked. Psychers in containment hoods probed his mind, their faces contorting in pain when they encountered the corrupted speed force lingering within him. Strange devices measured energy patterns in his cellular structure, producing readouts that the Inquisition staff studied with growing concern. Throughout it all, Barry cooperated, understanding that his survival depended on proving his humanity and his resistance to the chaos corruption. Each test revealed more about the nature of this universe, its perils, and the constant war against entities that dwelled in what they called the warp. He learned of the Imperium of Man, the Emperor who guided humanity from his golden throne, and the endless battle against Xenos, heretics, and demons. Hours later, exhausted and drained, Barry sat in a secured chamber as Inquisitor Grayfax reviewed the final test results. The null field collar remained around his neck, keeping the whispers at bay. But he could feel the corrupted speed force churning within him, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. The data is conclusive, Grayfax announced finally. You are human in origin, though your genetic structure shows signs of enhancement beyond standard templates. The warp corruption is present but contained, concentrated primarily in the energy field you generate when in motion. You speak truth about your origin as far as our psychers can determine. She set aside the data slate and fixed Barry with an intense gaze. This presents us with a unique opportunity. The Ordo Malleus has long studied methods of closing warp rifts and banishing entities back to the Immaterium. In theory, the same principles could return you to your universe, removing the conduit scene seeks to exploit. Barry felt a surge of hope. You can send me home? Potentially, Grayfax qualified, but it will require resources and rituals that cannot be performed here. We must travel to a more secure location, one protected by ancient wards and technologies designed specifically to interact with the Immaterium safely. She activated another holithic display showing a massive space station orbiting a barren planet. The Blackstone fortress Veles Vindicta, one of the Emperor's greatest weapons against the warp, constructed from Blackstone, a material that can repel or absorb warp energy, depending on its polarization. If anywhere in the Imperium has the means to send you back without opening a rift for chaos to exploit, it is there. Barry studied the image, noting the station's strange design like nothing he had seen in his universe. How do we get there? The Inquisition maintains its own fleet, Grayfax replied. A ship is being prepared as we speak. However, there is a complication. She manipulated the display, zooming out to show the surrounding space. A storm of energy writhed between the Blackstone fortress and their current position. A maelstrom of unnatural colors that hurt Barry's eyes. A warp storm has manifested between this system and our destination, she explained. No coincidence, I am certain. 10 moves to prevent your departure. The storm makes direct warp travel impossible, forcing us to take a longer route through real space with limited warp jumps where the storm thins. The journey will take weeks rather than days, Barry frowned. And in that time this Tzeentch will be working to stop us. Undoubtedly, the Chaos Gods are patient and cunning. Tzeentch, above all others, plots with unfathomable complexity. We can expect opposition from cultists, corrupted officials, daemon incursions, and worse. She deactivated the display and stood. Rest while you can, Barry Allen. We depart in 6 hours for the orbital docks. Once our journey begins, safety becomes a luxury we cannot afford. As promised, 6 hours later, Barry found himself aboard an inquisitorial transport, rising through the polluted atmosphere of the hive world. The nullfield collar remained in place, though Grayfax had adjusted it to allow him limited access to his speed if necessary for their defense. He stood at a viewport, watching the sprawling hive city recede below them, a cancer of industry and humanity spreading across the planet's surface. Your world, he murmured to a tech priest who stood nearby monitoring instruments. How do people live like this? The tech priest's mostly mechanical face betrayed no emotion, but his voice carried a hint of pride. They serve the Omnissiah and the Emperor, as is their duty. The hive worlds are the industrial heart of the Imperium, producing the weapons and materials that sustain humanity's dominion among the stars. Without their sacrifice, mankind would fall to Xenos predation or warp corruption within generations. Barry wanted to argue, to question the horrific conditions he had witnessed, but he recognized the futility. This was not his world, not his fight. His goal was to return home before the corruption, claiming his power spread further. The transport docked with a much larger vessel in orbit, a sleek warship bearing the inquisitorial insignia. Unlike the brutal industrial aesthetic of the hive world, the ship's interior combined military functionality with an almost cathedral-like reverence for its purpose. Servitors and crew members moved with precision through corridors lined with devotional shrines and weapon imp placements in equal measure. Barry was escorted to austere quarters near the ship's center, where the null field could be maintained most efficiently. Inquisitor Grayfax briefed him on the journey ahead, marking their planned route on a stellar chart that showed the twisted mass of the warp storm they would need to circumvent. We will make a series of short warp jumps between these systems, she explained, indicating points where the storm appeared thinner. Between jumps, we will travel at sublight speeds. The journey is approximately 4 weeks, assuming no complications. Barry nodded, trying to absorb the scale of space travel in this universe. And the Blackstone fortress can send me home? Its technologies are ancient, predating even the Imperium itself, Grayfax replied. The fortress contains warp gates that can be reconfigured for various purposes. With proper rituals and the application of Blackstone's null properties, we believe we can create a conduit similar to the one that brought you here, but controlled and directed precisely to your reality. She fixed him with a stern gaze. Until then, you will remain under constant monitoring. The collar will stay in place except in emergencies. Should you feel the corruption strengthening or the whispers returning, inform me immediately. If you succumb to chaos, I will not hesitate to execute you. Is this understood? Barry met her gaze evenly. Perfectly. I want this corruption gone as much as you do. The journey began smoothly. The inquisitorial vessel, which Barry learned was named the Unrelenting Truth, made its first warp jump without incident, emerging in a star system dominated by a dying red giant. As they prepared for the sublight portion of their journey, Barry was permitted limited movement throughout the ship, always accompanied by Grayfax's acolytes and always wearing the nullfield collar. He spent much of his time in the ship's archives, learning about the Imperium, its history, and the constant threats it faced. The more he understood about chaos and the warp, the more he recognized the danger of the corruption tainting his connection to the Speed Force. This universe's equivalent of his power source was a realm of madness and predatory entities that fed on mortal emotions and desires. 5 days into their journey, as they approached the coordinates for their second warp jump, the ship's astropaths began to scream in unison. Alarms blared throughout the vessel as sensor arrays detected multiple entities approaching at impossible speeds. Barry was summoned to the bridge where Grayfax stood before a tactical display showing their situation. Red runes indicated a dozen smaller craft converging on their position from multiple vectors. Chaos vessels, she stated grimly. Tzeentch cultists bearing the same energy signature as the corruption in your Speed Force. They should not have known our route. Someone has betrayed us. The ship rocked as the first enemy vessels came within weapons range, firing salvos of warp-infused energy that distorted reality where they struck the unrelenting truth's void shields. Crew members rushed to battle stations as the ship's own weapons powered up, returning fire with lance batteries and torpedo spreads. "How did they find us?" Barry asked, watching the tactical display with growing concern. More enemy vessels were appearing by the moment. A coordinated attack that threatened to overwhelm even the formidable inquisitorial ship. Grayfax's expression darkened. "They tracked you. The corruption in your speed force acts as a beacon in the warp. Tzeentch can sense your presence, particularly when we prepare to make warp jumps as the barrier between realities thins." The ship rocked again, more violently this time. A crew member reported, "Void shields at 60% capacity. 2 enemy vessels destroyed, but more are approaching from the system's outer reaches." Grayfax made a quick decision. "We cannot risk a warp jump with this many cult vessels present. They could follow us into the immaterium and attack where our defenses are weakest." She turned to Barry. "We need to thin their numbers first. This requires your assistance." She reached for the control device at her belt, adjusting settings on the null field collar. "I am reducing the collar's suppression effect. You will have access to more of your speed, but the corruption will grow stronger. Can you control it?" Barry nodded grimly. "I'll have to. What's the plan?" "We will launch assault boats carrying kill teams to eliminate the cult leadership on their command vessels. You will accompany my personal team. Your speed could be the difference between success and failure." As soon as the collar's effect diminished, Barry felt the corrupt whispers return, more insistent than before. The speed force surged within him, eager for release, tainted with the purplish energy he now recognized as the influence of Tzeentch. He pushed back against it mentally, containing the corruption through sheer willpower. Within minutes, Barry found himself aboard a sleek assault craft alongside Inquisitor Grayfax and a team of her most elite operatives. They wore carapace armor bearing inquisitorial symbols, their weapons humming with power as tech priests performed final blessing rituals on their ammunition. "Target is the vessel-designated Mindfire." Grayfax briefed them as the assault boat detached from the unrelenting truth. "Intelligence suggests it carries the cult sorcerer leadership. We eliminate them. The attack loses coordination." The journey across the void was tense and brief. The assault boat's engines strained as it evaded enemy fire, occasionally rocked by near misses that tested its reinforced hull. Through small viewports, Barry could see the space battle unfolding. Lance beams cutting through the darkness, explosions blooming in silence as vessels on both sides suffered critical damage. "Prepare for impact docking," announced the pilot. "Enemy void shields down in targeted section, breaching in 3, 2, 1. The assault boat slammed into the hull of the enemy vessel with bone-jarring force. Magnetic clamps engaged, securing it in place as breaching charges detonated, blasting a hole into the Mindfire's interior. Grayfax's kill team moved with practiced precision, securing the breach point and establishing a defensive perimeter within seconds. Barry followed them into the enemy ship, immediately struck by its bizarre architecture. Unlike the ordered Gothic design of the inquisitorial vessel, the Mindfire's corridors twisted in ways that defied Euclidean geometry. Adorned with symbols that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of one's eye, the air itself felt wrong, charged with energy that made his skin crawl. "Maintain mental discipline," Grayfax ordered as they advanced. "The ship's structure has been corrupted by warp influence. Trust your instruments, not your senses." The kill team encountered resistance almost immediately. Cultists in blue and gold robes charged from side passages, firing weapons that discharged bolts of multicolored energy. Barry accessed his speed, dodging between the bolts with ease, knocking cultists unconscious with precisely calculated strikes. With each use of the speed force, however, the corruption grew stronger. The whispers escalated to a chorus, promising power and knowledge beyond mortal comprehension. Purple energy crackled alongside the golden, the lightning surrounding his body, forming patterns that resembled staring eyes and grasping tentacles. "Resist it," Grayfax commanded, noticing his struggle as she put down a cultist with a precise bolt from her Inferno pistol. "Focus on our objective. The bridge should be 2 decks up." They fought their way through the twisting corridors, encountering increasingly bizarre defenders. Human cultists gave way to mutated abominations with too many limbs or eyes. then to floating horrors composed of pure warp energy contained within elaborate mechanical devices. Screamers identified one of Grayfax's acolytes firing a volley from a weapon that discharged nullifying energy. Demonic entities drawn to psychic activity. They sensed the speedster's power. The creatures keened as they swooped toward Barry, attracted to the corrupted speed force energy he emitted. He dodged their attacks by fractions of seconds, feeling their claws graze his suit as they passed. Each near miss sent jolts of corrupt energy through his system, the taint spreading deeper into his connection with the speed force. "I can't maintain control much longer," Barry warned, his voice strained as he fought both external enemies and the internal corruption. "The collar isn't strong enough anymore." Grayfax dispatched another daemon with her power sword, the blade's disruption field, causing the entity to dissolve back into raw warp energy. "We're close to the bridge. Once the sorcerers are eliminated, we can return to the null field generators on our ship." They reached what appeared to be the bridge access, a massive door inscribed with symbols that pulsed with malevolent light. The kill team's tech priest approached, attempting to bypass the locking mechanism, only to recoil as the symbols flared and burned through his mechanical implants. Warded against conventional intrusion, he reported, his voice distorted by damaged vox emitters. "The machine spirits cannot break the sorceress seal." Barry studied the door, seeing energy patterns in the symbols that reminded him of the speed force in its purest form. "I might be able to vibrate through it. The frequency of these symbols matches certain aspects of my power." Grayfax hesitated, weighing the risks. "The corruption will strengthen significantly if you attempt this. Can you maintain control?" "I have to try," Barry replied. "We don't have much time before they realize we're here and prepare defenses." The Inquisitor nodded grimly. "Proceed. We will follow once you secure the entrance." Barry accessed the speed force fully for the first time since arriving in this universe. The corrupt whispers erupted into triumphant screams as the purple energy surged alongside his golden lightning. His molecules began to vibrate at the precise frequency needed to phase through the warded door, his body becoming intangible. As he passed through the solid matter, he felt the corruption attempting to seize control. Tendrils of malevolent consciousness worming into his thoughts. Visions flashed through his mind, glimpses of realities where he had surrendered to the taint, becoming a godlike entity of pure motion, reshaping universes according to Tzeentch's inscrutable designs. With supreme effort, Barry pushed the visions aside, focusing on his goal. He emerged on the other side of the door, momentarily disoriented by the bridge's impossible geometry. The chamber stretched farther than the ship's dimensions should allow, its ceiling lost in swirling mists of warp energy. At its center stood three robed figures surrounding a pulsing crystalline structure that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The sorcerers turned as one to face him, their faces hidden beneath ornate masks shaped like beaked aven predators. They raised staffs topped with the same eye symbols Barry had seen in the corrupted Speed Force lightning, channeling warp energy into visible beams that struck him simultaneously. The impact sent Barry crashing into the wall, his speed temporarily disrupted by the sorceress attack. The corruption surged, feeding on the direct contact with Tzeentch's power. Purple lightning overtook the gold in his aura, forming leering faces and grasping claws that reached toward the sorcerers as if seeking to join them. "The Herald arrives," intoned the central sorcerer, his voice echoing strangely as if multiple beings spoke in unison. "The changer of ways for this moment. Your resistance is admirable but futile, Speedster. Your power was always meant to serve chaos." Barry struggled to his feet, fighting to maintain control of his own body as the corruption spread. "I serve no one," he ground out, gathering what remained of his uncorrupted Speed Force energy, especially not entities that feed on suffering and madness. The sorcerers began a chant in a language that hurt Barry's ears, their staffs drawing energy from the crystalline structure. The chamber's reality began to warp more dramatically, sections of floor and wall disappearing to reveal glimpses of a realm of pure chaos where physics and reason had no meaning. "They're opening a direct portal to the warp." Barry realized in horror, "They're trying to pull me in completely." With a final desperate effort, he accelerated, pushing through the pain as the corruption fought for control. Time slowed to a crawl around him as he entered a level of speed few beings in any universe could comprehend. The sorcerer's movements became imperceptible. Frozen in the midst of their ritual, Barry raced around the chamber, analyzing the crystalline structure from every angle. It was a warp navigation device, he realized, similar to, but more corrupt than the technologies he had seen on the inquisitorial ship. It served as both the cult fleet coordination system and as an amplifier for their sorcerous powers. If he could disrupt it properly, it might sever their connection to Saint long enough for Grayfax's team to breach the chamber. But direct contact would expose him to even more corruption, possibly pushing him beyond the point of no return. A calculated risk. Barry vibrated his hand at the precise resonant frequency of the crystal, a technique he had used countless times to shatter materials in his home universe. As his vibrating molecules made contact with the warp-infused structure, agony lanced through his entire being. The crystal's energy fought his intrusion, attempting to reverse the vibration pattern and tear his molecules apart. Simultaneously, the corruption in his speed force surged to unprecedented levels, the purple energy completely overtaking the gold, forming a cocoon of malevolent power around his body. "You are ours." The words emerged from his own mouth, but the voice was not his own. "The body rejects, but the power welcomes us." The Changer of Ways claims the speed force as his domain. With a scream of defiance, Barry pushed beyond his limits, accelerating his molecules beyond anything he had attempted before. The crystal structure began to fracture along multiple dimensional planes, reality itself protesting the violation of its fundamental laws. The door to the bridge exploded inward as Grayfax and her kill team breached the entrance, weapons blazing. The Inquisitor took in the situation instantly, directing her acolytes to engage the sorcerers while she herself raced toward Barry and the failing crystal. "Alan, break contact now," she commanded, raising a device that pulsed with null energy. "The destabilization is cascading." Barry couldn't respond. The corruption had nearly overtaken him, his consciousness subsumed by the whispers that were now deafening screams of triumph. Through eyes that no longer felt like his own, he watched as Tzeentch's power flowed through him into the fracturing crystal, accelerating its collapse. Grayfax reached him, slapping the null device directly onto his chest. A wave of anti-warp energy pulsed outward momentarily, severing his connection to the corrupted speed force. In that instant of clarity, Barry wrenched his hand free of the crystal and collapsed to the deck. His body racked with spasms as the corruption and the null energy warred within him. The crystal's destabilization reached critical mass. Reality tore open around it, creating a localized warp rift that began to consume the bridge. The sorcerers abandoned their fight with the kill team, rushing toward the rift with arms outstretched in ecstatic welcome. "Fall back," Grayfax ordered, dragging Barry's semi-conscious form toward the exit. "The ship is lost. The rift will consume it entirely." Barry struggled to help, his legs barely responding to his commands. The corruption had receded thanks to the null device, but his connection to the speed force had been severely damaged by the conflict. He could barely maintain regular human speed as they raced through the collapsing corridors of the cult ship. Behind them, the warp rift expanded, devouring matter and converting it into pure chaotic energy. Cultists ran screaming toward the growing anomaly, their minds broken by its proximity, while others fled in terror, only to be caught by its inexorable advance. The ship's structure twisted and reformed in impossible geometries as the laws of physics surrendered to warp influence. The kill team reached their assault boat, securing Barry inside as Grayfax performed an emergency detachment sequence. The magnetic clamps released just as the hull section they had attached to began to warp and distort. Tentacles of living metal reaching for the retreating craft. The pilot pushed the engines beyond safety parameters, putting distance between them and the doomed vessel. Through the viewports, they watched as the mind fire collapsed in on itself, reality folding like paper around the warp rift before the entire ship vanished in an implosion of unnatural energies. "The cult fleet is in disarray," reported in Restition. Acolyte monitoring communications. Without the coordination from the flagship, they're breaking formation. The unrelenting truth is picking them off systematically. Grayfax nodded in satisfaction, then turned her attention to Barry. He lay on the assault boat's deck, the null device still attached to his chest, his breathing shallow and irregular. The speedster's suit was torn in multiple places, revealing skin crisscrossed with purplish veins where the corruption had seeped into his physical form.
"His condition is deteriorating," she observed grimly.
"The corruption has progressed further than we anticipated. The null device is keeping it contained, but his body is rejecting the treatment." One of her acolytes, a medic specialist, examined Barry's vital signs, cellular degradation accelerating. The conflict between the null field and the warp energy is tearing him apart at the molecular level. He requires more comprehensive treatment than we can provide here. Barry drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of their conversation, but unable to respond. He felt the corruption lurking at the edges of his perception, temporarily restrained but growing stronger as his resistance weakened. In moments of lucidity, he saw visions of Central City, of his friends and family, memories that seemed increasingly distant and unreal compared to the nightmare reality he now inhabited. The assault boat docked with the unrelenting truth, and Barry was rushed to the ship's apothecarian. There, tech priests and Medicaid specialists worked feverishly to stabilize his condition, applying technologies and treatments alien to his understanding. Null-field generators surrounded his bed, creating a bubble of relative normality that allowed his body to recover from the molecular damage. Days passed in a haze of pain and disjointed awareness. Sometimes Barry would awaken to find Inquisitor Grayfax at his bedside, studying him with a mixture of concern and calculation. Other times, tech priests would be adjusting equipment or extracting samples of his blood for analysis, muttering prayers to their machine god as they worked. Gradually, his strength returned, though the corruption remained held at bay, but not eliminated by the null field. When he was finally able to sit up and speak coherently, Grayfax came to deliver news of their situation. "The cult fleet has been destroyed," she informed him, "but our victory came at a cost. The unrelenting truth sustained significant damage to its warp engines. Repairs are underway, but our journey to the Blackstone fortress will be delayed." Barry absorbed this information with growing concern. "How long?" "At least 3 additional weeks," Grayfax replied, "and the warp storm continues to grow." Tzeentch is not subtle in his displeasure at losing his prize. She activated a holothic display showing their current position in the expanding storm. "The corruption within you has stabilized for now, but the null field cannot contain it indefinitely. Each time you access your speed, the taint spreads further. By the time we reach the Blackstone fortress, you may be beyond salvation." Barry studied the display, noting the distance they still needed to travel. There has to be another way. A closer location with similar technology or a different approach entirely. Grayfax hesitated, then adjusted the display to show a different location. "There is an alternative. A research station in a nearby system operated by the Ordo Malleus. They study warp phenomena and methods of containment. Their facilities are not as comprehensive as the Blackstone fortress, but they might be able to purge the corruption from your system, even if they cannot send you home immediately." "Why didn't you mention this before?" The Inquisitor's expression darkened. "Because the station's research is dangerous and morally questionable by even inquisitorial standards. They experiment with controlled warp exposure, testing the limits of cancer, human resistance to corruption. Many of their subjects do not survive the procedures." It was a last resort. Barry considered the options. Continue to the Blackstone fortress, potentially succumbing to corruption before arrival, or risk deadly procedures at the research station with the hope of at least surviving, even if he couldn't return home immediately. "How soon can we reach the research station?" 3 days at maximum sustainable speed," Grayfax replied. "I've already altered our course, anticipating your decision. The captain awaits only my confirmation to proceed." Barry nodded grimly. "Do it. I'd rather risk death than become a vessel for a chaos god." The unrelenting truth altered course, pushing its engines to their limits as they raced toward the research station. The journey was tense, with constant monitoring of both the ship's systems and Barry's condition. The corruption within him seemed to sense their destination, growing more aggressive despite the null field containment, causing episodes where purple lightning would erupt from his body, damaging equipment and injuring unwary crew members who ventured too close. By the time they reached the station, Barry was confined to a specialized containment chamber, multiple null field generators creating overlapping fields to restrain the corruption. His consciousness flickered between clarity and nightmare visions of Tzeentch's realm, where entities with too many eyes and limbs mocked his resistance and promised eternal torment for defying their master's will. The research station orbited a dead world stripped of all resources generations ago, its surface scarred by ancient mining operations and weapons testing. The station itself was an ominous structure of black metal and strange, crystalline materials bristling with defensive weapons and scanner arrays that constantly monitored the surrounding space for warp anomalies. Transfer to the station was a complex operation, requiring precise timing and multiple containment protocols. Barry was moved inside a portable null-field generator, essentially a coffin-like device that maintained the dampening effect during transit. Even so, The corruption fought against the restraints, causing power fluctuations and system failures that nearly resulted in catastrophe several times during the journey. Inside the station, Barry was greeted by a figure unlike any he had encountered in this universe. A woman of indeterminate age, her body so heavily augmented with cybernetics that little organic matter remained visible. Her skull had been replaced entirely with a transparent crystal housing that revealed her living brain surrounded by delicate mechanical interfaces and fluid-filled tubes that pulsed with unknown chemicals. "Fascinating specimen," she observed, her voice emerging from a vox emitter in her throat rather than a human mouth. "I am Magos biologist Sirene Vasilv, chief researcher at this facility. The corruption pattern is unlike any I have documented in 3 centuries of study." Barry could barely focus on her words, the pain of restraining the corruption consuming most of his consciousness. "Can you help me?" he managed to ask through gritted teeth. "Help is a subjective term," the Magos replied dispassionately. "We can attempt to separate the warp corruption from your unique energy matrix. The procedure has a 28% survival rate based on previous subjects, though none possessed your specific physiology or powers." She gestured to waiting tech priests who began moving Barry's containment unit toward the center of the facility. "Preparations are already underway. Inquisitor Grayfax has authorized experimental protocols, usually reserved for high-value assets. You should be honored." The central chamber of the research station resembled a combination of operating theater, religious shrine, and physics laboratory. A massive device dominated the space, consisting of 2 opposing pylons of black stone. The material Grayfax had mentioned could repel or absorb warp energy. Between them stood a platform surrounded by machinery of incomprehensible purpose. Servitors and tech priests moving in coordinated patterns as they made final adjustments. Barry was transferred to the platform, the portable null field deactivated just long enough for restraints to be applied to his limbs and torso. The corruption surged immediately, purple lightning lashing out at the tech priests who retreated behind shield generators as their ritual preparations continued. Inquisitor Grayfax approached the platform, her expression solemn. "The procedure will attempt to separate the corrupted warp energy from your natural speed force connection. The Blackstone will be polarized to absorb the corruption while leaving your base power intact. In theory." Barry nodded weakly, sweat beading on his forehead as he fought to maintain control. "And if it fails, then I will grant you the Emperor's mercy before the corruption consumes you completely," she replied, patting the Inferno pistol at her hip. "It is the most I can offer." The Magos biologies initiated the procedure with a series of binary commands to the machinery. The Blackstone pylons began to hum with energy, emitting a field that made reality itself seem to ripple. Barry felt the corruption respond, the whispers rising to screams of rage and defiance as the pylon's effect began to pull at the tainted energy within him. Pain beyond description coursed through his body as the procedure began in earnest. The corruption fought its extraction with everything it had, tearing at his cellular structure, trying to bind itself permanently to his connection with the Speed Force. Barry screamed until his voice gave out, his body arching against the restraints as the battle between technology and warp energy played out within his very molecules. Through the agony, he became aware of something unexpected. As the black stone pulled at but the corruption, he felt his connection to the pure Speed Force strengthening, not the tainted version he had experienced since arriving in this universe, but the clean golden energy he knew from home. It responded to the procedure in ways the Mechanicus researchers couldn't have anticipated. Working in concert with the Blackstone to purge the corruption, the Magos noticed the readings changing, her augmented brain processing the data faster than any normal human could. "Anomalous energy signature detected," she announced. "The subject's baseline power is actively assisting the purge protocol, adjusting Blackstone polarization to optimize extraction." The pylon's hum deepened, the energy field between them intensifying, to a blinding light that forced even the augmented observers to shield their visual senses. Within the field, Barry felt the corruption being forcibly extracted, pulled from his cells like poison from a wound. The whispers of Tzeentch faded to distant echoes, then to nothing as the tainted energy was absorbed by the black stone. As the corruption receded, Barry's connection to the Speed Force clarified, becoming stronger and purer than it had been since his arrival. He felt its familiar embrace, the energy that had defined his life as a hero, untainted by the malevolence of the warp. For the first time since arriving in this nightmare universe, he felt truly like himself again. The procedure reached its crescendo. A final surge of energy pulsing between the pylons as the last vestiges of corruption were drawn from Barry's system. The Blackstone glowed with an unnatural purple light as it contained the absorbed warp energy, its crystalline structure visibly straining under the load. "Purge complete," announced the Magos as the machinery powered down. "Subject stable. Corruption contained within the Blackstone matrices." Barry lay exhausted on the platform, his restraints automatically releasing as the danger passed. His body ached in ways he had never experienced, but his mind was clear. Free from the constant whispers that had plagued him since his arrival, he could feel the speed force flowing through him once more, pure and untainted. Inquisitor Grayfax approached cautiously, her hand still resting on her weapon. "Alan, are you cognizant?" Barry nodded weakly. "I'm here. The corruption. It's gone. I can feel the difference." The Inquisitor gestured to a psyker who stepped forward and placed his hands near, but not touching Barry's head. After a moment of concentration, the psyker nodded. "No warp taint detected," he confirmed. "His aura is unusual but clean. The procedure appears successful." Relief washed over Barry as he sat up slowly, taking stock of his condition. His suit was in tatters, his body covered in a network of fading scars where the corruption had tried to burrow into his physical form, but beneath the damage he could feel his strength returning, his connection to the Speed Force growing stronger with each passing moment. "What happens now?" he asked, looking between Grayfax and the Magos. "Can you still help me get home?" The Magos tilted her crystal-encased head, processing data streams visible as flashing lights within her transparent skull. The Blackstone procedure was only the first step. Now that the corruption has been removed, we can analyze your baseline energy signature more accurately, potentially developing a method to return you to your original universe. "How long will that take?" "Impossible to provide an exact time frame," the Magos replied. "Weeks at minimum, possibly months. The science of cross-dimensional transit remains largely theoretical, even for the Mechanicus." Barry's heart sank at the prospect of being trapped in this nightmare galaxy for months. Every day here was another day his friends and family back home would believe him lost or dead, another day for new threats to emerge in Central City without the Flash to protect it. Grayfax seemed to sense his despair. "The research will continue while you recover your strength. Once you are stable, we still have the option of proceeding to the Blackstone Fortress, where the technologies for manipulating reality are more advanced." As they discussed next steps, an alarm suddenly blared throughout the station. Red warning lumens flashed as automated systems activated defensive protocols. The Magos received data directly through her neural interfaces, her mechanical body tensing in a simulation of human concern. Multiple warp signatures detected approaching the station. She announced configuration matches Thousand Suns attack craft. "They have found us." Grayfax cursed under her breath. "Cien's elite servants. They must have tracked the corruption even as we extracted it." "How many?" "3 vessels, cruiser class," the Magos replied. "Heavily armed and likely carrying sorcerer cadras. Our defenses are substantial but not designed to repel a concentrated assault of this magnitude." Inquisitor turned to Barry. "Can you move? Your speed may be our only advantage if the station is breached." Barry tested his connection to the Speed Force, feeling it respond more readily than it had since his arrival. The corruption was gone, but he could sense that using his power in this universe still carried risks. The warp was too similar to the Speed Force, too ready to intermingle with it. Yet they had no choice. "I can run," he confirmed, standing on unsteady legs. "But without the corruption to track, maybe we can escape before they reach us. The unrelenting truth can outrun them, right?" Grayfax shook her head grimly. "The ship sustained damage in our encounter with the cult fleet. Its engines are operating at reduced capacity. The Thousand Suns vessels would overtake us before we reached the next system. The station rocked as the first wave of attack struck its void shields. Warning signals indicated shield strength dropping rapidly under the concentrated fire. "The Blackstone," Barry said suddenly, pointing to the pylons that had absorbed the corruption. "You said it can repel warp energy when polarized differently. Can we use it as a weapon against them?" The Magos and Grayfax exchanged glances, a rare moment of surprise shared between them. "Theoretically," the Magos acknowledged, "the absorbed corruption could be repolarized and projected outward. It would create a localized anti-warp field that might disrupt their ship systems. However, the process was never designed for offensive deployment." "Then we adapt," Barry insisted. "I've spent my life improvising with my powers. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that energy can always be redirected." After a moment's calculation, the Magos nodded. "The Speedster's proposal has merit, initiating emergency reconfiguration of the Blackstone array." As the tech priests rushed to modify the equipment, the station sustained another barrage of attacks. Warning signals indicated hull breaches. In the outer sections, and security feeds showed armored figures teleporting aboard, their blue and gold armor adorned with Avan iconography that Barry recognized from the cult ship. Thousand Suns Terminators. Grayfax identified them, drawing her power, sword, and inferno pistol. Elite warriors corrupted 10,000 years ago during the Horus Heresy. Their bodies are dust contained within their armor, animated by sorcerous energy. Conventional weapons have limited effect. She activated her Vox communicator, ordering station security forces to defensive positions. But her expression made it clear they were fighting a losing battle. The Thousand Suns were legendary warriors, enhanced transhuman killers whose skills had been honed over millennia of warfare. "How long until the Blackstone can be repurposed?" Barry asked the Magos, watching the security feeds as the invaders methodically advanced through the station, reality warping around them as their sorcerers unleashed warp powers against the defenders. 15 minutes at minimum," she replied, her augmented limbs moving with inhuman precision as she assisted the reconfiguration. The polarization reversal requires careful calibration to avoid catastrophic feedback. Barry looked at the security feeds again. They didn't have 15 minutes. The Thousand Suns were advancing too quickly, their sorceress powers overwhelming the station's defenses section by section. He needed to buy time. "I'll slow them down," he announced, accessing the Speed Force. Golden lightning crackled around his body, blessedly free of the purple corruption that had tainted it before. "Just get that weapon ready." Before Grayfax could object, Barry was gone, racing through the station's corridors toward the advancing invaders. His speed felt different than it had on Earth, more volatile and powerful, as if the background energy of this universe amplified his connection to the Speed Force. He controlled it carefully, wary of drawing the attention of warp entities. Again, he encountered the first squad of Thousand Suns Terminators at a junction between habitation blocks. They were massive figures in ornate armor, carrying weapons that discharged bolts of warp-infused energy. Their movements were unnaturally fluid for beings of such size, animated by sorcery rather than muscle and bone. Barry didn't attempt to fight them directly. Instead, he used his speed to confuse and misdirect, creating after images that drew their fire while he systematically disarmed them, removing weapons from their grasp faster than they could react. When one tried to unleash a warp spell, Barry disrupted the sorcerer's concentration with a supersonic shockwave, created by circling him at extreme velocity. The Thousand Suns adapted quickly, however. One sorcerer conjured a field of temporal distortion that slowed everything within its radius, nearly catching Barry in its effect. Another summoned screaming warp entities similar to those he had faced on the cult ship, creatures drawn to movement and speed. Barry was forced to retreat, leading the entities away from the central laboratory where the Blackstone weapon was being prepared. He raced through the station's corridors, the warp creatures pursuing him like hunting hounds, leaving trails of reality distortion in their wake. Where they passed, metal corroded and electronics failed, the very substance of the material universe rejecting their presence. As he ran, Barry formulated a plan. The creatures were drawn to his speed, to the energy he generated when moving. Perhaps he could use that to turn their nature against them. He altered course, heading for the station's reactor section. The massive plasma core that powered the facility was contained within multiple force fields designed to prevent catastrophic overloads. Those same fields might contain the warp entities long enough for the Blackstone weapon to be deployed. Reaching the reactor chamber, Barry circled the massive plasma core at increasing speed, creating a vortex of speed force energy that pulsed and flared like a beacon. As he had hoped, the warp creatures altered their course, drawn to the concentrated energy like moths to a flame. The moment they entered the chamber, Barry triggered the emergency containment protocols from a control panel, sealing the reactor section behind layers of energy fields and vacuum barriers. The creatures screamed in rage as they realized the trap, hurling themselves against the containment fields with increasing fury. "Alan, report status." Grayfax's voice came through a Vox communicator he had taken from a fallen security officer. "The Blackstone array is at 70% reconfiguration. We need another 5 minutes." "Reactor section secured temporarily," Barry replied, watching as cracks began to appear in the containment fields where the warp entities attacked most ferociously. "But it won't hold them for long. They're stronger than I expected." He raced back toward the central laboratory, encountering more Thousand Sun squads along the way. They had adapted to his tactics now, deploying area effect weapons and warp powers that didn't require precise targeting. One unleashed a wave of transmutation energy that turned the very air to crystalline shards, forcing Barry to evacuate an entire deck before his lungs were shredded. By the time he returned to the laboratory, the situation had deteriorated further. The Thousand Suns had breached the outer defenses and were converging on the central chamber from multiple directions. Station security forces fought a desperate holding action in the corridors, buying time with their lives for the Blackstone weapon to be completed. "Status?" Barry asked, skidding to a halt beside Grayfax, who was directing the defense while the Magos completed the reconfiguration. "Final calibration in progress," the Inquisitor replied, firing her Inferno pistol at a Thousand Suns Terminator who had broken due and first through the western barricade. The weapon's beam melted through ancient ceramite armor, reducing the warrior inside to dust. But we face another problem. The weapon must be activated from the station's central control spire. The targeting systems cannot be operated remotely. Barry glanced at the security feeds. The control spire was 3 levels up, currently caught between 2 advancing Thousand Sun squads. "I can get there, but what about everyone here?" "We will hold as long as possible," Grayfax stated with grim determination. "The weapon must be activated. If the Thousand Suns capture this technology, they could use it to open permanent warp rifts across dozens of Imperial worlds." The Magos approached, her mechanical body damaged from warp exposure but still functional. "The reconfiguration is complete. This data slate contains the activation codes and targeting parameters." She handed the device to Barry. "When connected to the control spire's main coitator, it will initialize the weapon sequence. The Blackstone will emit an expanding null field that should disrupt all warp-based technology and entities within the system." Barry took the data slate, securing it within what remained of his suit. "Will it affect me?" "My powers." The Magos tilted her crystal-encased head. "Unknown. Your energy signature is similar to warp energy in some respects, but fundamentally different in origin. You may experience temporary disruption, but should recover, unlike the Thousand Suns, whose existence depends entirely on warp sustenance." It was a risk Barry had to take. The alternative was allowing Tzeentch's forces to capture him, the Blackstone, and potentially open the way for a full-scale demonic invasion. After what he had experienced of chaos corruption, he couldn't allow that to happen, even if it meant sacrificing his own powers or life. "I'll do it," he confirmed, accessing the Speed Force once more. "Get everyone you can to the escape pods. Once the weapon activates, you won't have much time to evacuate before the null field affects the station systems too." Grayfax nodded, a rare look of respect crossing her severe features. "The Emperor protects those who sacrifice for humanity, Alan. Even those from beyond our universe. Go with his blessing." Barry accelerated, leaving the laboratory in a flash of golden lightning. He raced through corridors filled with combat, moving too fast for either side to track his progress. Where possible, he assisted the station's defenders, disarming Thousand Suns warriors or creating distractions that allowed security forces to fall back to more defensible positions. The journey to the control spire became increasingly treacherous as the station's structure began to fail under the assault. Gravity fluctuated in sections where warp sorcery had corrupted the generators. Entire corridors shifted in impossible ways, turning simple paths into non-Euclidean mazes designed to trap and confuse. Barry pushed his speed to new limits, finding that the speed force responded differently here than on Earth. Without the corruption tainting it, he could access deeper levels of power, perceiving reality in ways he never had before. He could see the underlying structure of the station, not just its physical form, but the patterns of energy and probability that defined its existence in the materium. Using this enhanced perception, he navigated the warping corridors, finding paths that shouldn't have existed, slipping between moments of reality, where the station's original configuration briefly reasserted itself against the warp influence. He reached the control spire just as 2,000 sun squads converged on it from opposite directions. The station's last defenders lay dead at their posts, torn apart by warp powers or bolter fire. The main coitator terminal stood at the center of the circular chamber, its screens displaying the advancing null field coverage that would soon emanate from the Blackstone array. Barry connected the data slate to the terminal, initiating the activation sequence. The system accepted the codes, displays shifting to show power building in the reconfigured Blackstone. A countdown appeared showing 30 seconds until discharge. As the sequence initiated, the chamber's doors blew inward, admitting a figure that radiated power unlike any Barry had encountered in this universe. 1,000-sun sorcerer lord, his armor more ornate than his warriors, crowned with curved horns that glowed with eldritch energy. Reality distorted around him, bending in ways that hurt Barry's eyes to observe. The Herald of Motion, the sorcerer lord intoned, his voice echoing strangely as if multiple beings spoke through him. Tzeentch has foreseen this moment. Your defiance changes nothing. All paths lead to the changer of ways. Barry accessed the speed force, preparing to defend the terminal until the weapon activated. The sorcerer responded with a gesture that sent a wave of transmutation energy through the chamber, turning metal to flesh and back again, forcing Barry to dodge frantically to avoid being caught in the effect. Your universe sent you here for a purpose, Speedster. The sorcerer continued, unleashing another warp attack that split into 9 separate energy projectiles, each tracking Barry's movements independently. The great game includes all realities, all possibilities. Your speed force and our warp are reflections of the same underlying power, separated only by the thinnest of veils. Barry evaded the tracking projectiles by vibrating at a frequency that caused them to pass through his form harmlessly. You're wrong, he replied, launching a counterattack with a barrage of supersonic punches that the sorcerer deflected with a shield of pure warp energy. The speed force is about potential and life. Your warp is about corruption and death. The countdown continued, 15 seconds remaining. The sorcerer lord seemed to realize the danger, his attacks growing more frenzied. He summoned a whirling vortex of warp fire that filled the chamber, leaving Barry nowhere to run. The speedster responded by creating his own counter-vortex, using the speed force to generate a vacuum that consumed the sorceress flames. 10 seconds. The Blackstone array was visibly glowing even through the multiple decks separating it from the control spire, its energy building to impossible levels. The station's structure groaned under the strain, support beams buckling as reality itself prepared for the coming disruption. The sorcerer made a final desperate attack, opening a small warp rift directly in front of the terminal. Demonic entities began to emerge, reaching for the controls with clawed limbs, seeking to interrupt the countdown. 5 seconds. Barry threw himself toward the rift, using his vibrating hand as a wedge of pure kinetic energy. He struck the tier in reality with all the force he could muster, forcing it closed through sheer speed and momentum. The backlash sent him crashing into the terminal, his body smoking from warp exposure. 3, 2, 1, the Blackstone discharged, releasing a wave of null energy that expanded outward at the speed of light. Where it passed, warp energy simply ceased to exist, severed from the materium by the repolarized Blackstone's effect. The sorcerer lord screamed as his powers vanished, his armor collapsing inward as the warp entities sustaining his ancient remains were banished back to the immaterium. The wave continued outward, engulfing the station, the attacking Thousand Suns vessels, and eventually the entire star system. All warp-based technology failed instantly, from the smallest personal shield to the massive engines that powered the Thousand Suns cruisers. The ships drifted powerless, their crews reduced to dust as the sorcery animating them dissipated. Barry felt the null wave pass through him, expecting pain or the loss of his powers. Instead, he experienced a moment of perfect clarity. The speed force within him seemed to crystallize, becoming more defined and focused than it had ever been. In that instant of purification, he saw something extraordinary. A pathway home. Not physical, not even energy-based, but a pattern in the speed force itself. A resonance frequency that aligned perfectly with his home universe. The Blackstone's null effect had stripped away the interference that had prevented him from perceiving it before, revealing the way back as clearly as a beacon in darkness. As the station began to break apart around him, its systems failing under the Blackstone's continuing effect, Barry made a decision. The pathway would not remain visible for long. Once the null field began to dissipate, the natural warp energies of this universe would obscure it again. It was now or never. He accessed the speed force, feeling it respond more purely than ever before. Golden lightning surrounded his form as he began to vibrate at precisely the frequency revealed by the Blackstone's effect. Reality itself began to warp around him, not in the chaotic, corrupting way of the warp, but in the clean, purposeful manner of the speed force at its most fundamental level. A tier opened before him, not leading to the nightmare realm of the warp, but to the familiar energy patterns of his home universe. Through the rift, he could see Central City in the distance, its skyline unmistakable. Even from this perspective outside conventional space-time, Barry cast one last glance at the disintegrating station. Somewhere in the chaos, Inquisitor Grayfax and her forces were evacuating, carrying the knowledge gained from his visit. Perhaps they would find better ways to combat chaos corruption, using what they had learned about the speed force. Perhaps his brief presence in their nightmare universe would make a difference. Then he was running, accelerating through the rift, feeling reality shift around him as he crossed the boundary between universes. The tier sealed behind him, cutting off the corrupting influence of the 41st millennium forever. Ahead lay home and the endless possibilities of a universe not yet fallen to darkness and despair. In the ruined research station, as emergency systems failed and void shields collapsed, Inquisitor Grayfax watched the final sensor readings from the control spire. The anomaly had vanished in a flash of golden energy, leaving no trace of its passage except a fading signature that the coitators could barely comprehend. The speedster has returned to his universe, she noted in her data slate, recording her final observations before evacuating. His resistance to chaos corruption suggests possibilities worth further study. The speed force, while vulnerable to warp influence, proved ultimately incompatible with Tien's designs. And so, as the last escape pod carrying the Inquisitor and her hard-won knowledge fled the dying station, a different kind of lightning briefly illuminated the void. This new light wasn't the corrupted purple of the warp, nor was it the pure familiar gold of the speedster's power. It was something new, something in between, a unique manifestation born from the violent interaction of two completely different universes. You see, the warp remembers everything, and somewhere in its truly unfathomable depths, the great schemer, the changer of ways, added one more strand to his infinite, intricate web of possibilities. It was a thread of pure golden lightning, one that now raced between realities forever and tantalizingly just beyond his grasp.